Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet suburbs of Creve Coeur, Missouri, a story unfolded in November 2019 that would shake a community to its core. It's a tale of secrets, betrayal, and a marriage that concealed darker truths beneath its seemingly perfect surface. This is the story of Jennifer Rothwell, a brilliant young woman whose life was cut tragically short by the person who had promised to love and protect her. Jennifer Lynn Rothwell was 28 years old in the autumn of 2019, living what many would consider an enviable life in suburban St. Louis County. She was a chemical engineer at DuPont, where her colleagues knew her as skilled, dedicated, and trustworthy. Her days were filled with complex calculations and problem-solving, work that suited her methodical mind and attention to detail. Jennifer had met her husband, Bo Rothwell, nearly a decade earlier during their college years at the University of Missouri. It was spring 2010, and they were both engineering students when their paths crossed in a laboratory. There's something almost poetic about two future engineers meeting in a place dedicated to discovery and innovation, though the discoveries that would later emerge from their relationship would be far darker than anything they studied in those bright university halls. Their courtship followed a familiar pattern of young love. College sweethearts who shared similar academic interests, they seemed well matched. Both were intelligent, ambitious, and appeared to want the same things from life. After graduation, they built a life together in Missouri, eventually settling in a comfortable home in Creve Coeur, a community known for its tree-lined streets and sense of safety. By 2019, Bo worked as a data engineer, and Jennifer had established herself in her career at DuPont. From the outside, they embodied the American dream, educated professionals with good careers, a nice home, and what appeared to be a stable marriage. But as we so often discover in these stories, the surface rarely tells the complete truth. Beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, Bo Rothwell was living a double life. While Jennifer focused on her career and their marriage, Bo had begun an affair with another woman. The relationship had developed over time, growing from what might have begun as innocent interactions into something that would ultimately consume his thoughts and drive him toward unthinkable actions. The psychology of infidelity is complex, and what drives someone to betray their spouse varies from case to case. For Bo, this relationship represented something he felt was missing from his marriage. The excitement of secrecy, perhaps, or the intoxication of feeling desired by someone new. Whatever the psychological underpinnings, by late October 2019, this affair had become a central part of his life. Text messages that would later be revealed during his trial showed the depth of his emotional investment in this relationship. On October 30, 2019, just weeks before Jennifer's death, Bo was exchanging Facebook messages with his mistress, messages that prosecutors would later argue showed his intent to leave his marriage behind, permanently. But there was a complication developing that would change everything. On October 26, 2019, Jennifer Rothwell discovered something that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. She was pregnant. The news of pregnancy should have been joyful for a married couple, but for Jennifer, it seems to have triggered immediate concern about her husband's reaction. In what would become one of the most haunting details of this case, Jennifer turned to her phone and searched for advice on a situation that revealed her deepest fears about her marriage. Jennifer Rothwell had looked up, "What to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant," on her cell phone before she went missing. Think about the vulnerability captured in that search query. Here was a young woman, 6 weeks into what should have been a celebrated pregnancy, worried enough about her husband's reaction to seek guidance from the internet. What kind of relationship dynamic leads a wife to fear telling her husband about their unborn child? What signs had she seen? What conversations had they had? What undercurrents in their marriage made her feel the need to prepare for his potential anger rather than his joy? The search was conducted on her phone, a private moment of anxiety that would later become a key piece of evidence in understanding the state of the Rothwell marriage. It suggests that Jennifer may have sensed something was wrong, that the man she had married and built a life with might not react to their impending parenthood with the happiness she hoped for. The couple mentioned a pregnancy test on October 26 and Bo Rothwell allegedly broke up with his girlfriend the next day. This timeline is crucial to understanding what happened next. Jennifer's pregnancy was confirmed, Bo ended his affair, and Jennifer scheduled her 8-week appointment for November 26. But the ending of the affair appears to have been temporary, a reaction to the immediate crisis rather than a genuine commitment to his marriage. Tuesday, November 12, 2019, began like any other day in the Rothwell household. Jennifer went to work at DuPont, contributing to projects that required her expertise and attention. Bo went to his job as a data engineer. To their neighbors and colleagues, it was an ordinary Tuesday in suburban Missouri. But by that evening, everything would change. The exact sequence of events that occurred in the Rothwell home that night would later be reconstructed through evidence, testimony, and Bo's own eventual confession. What we know is that a confrontation occurred between husband and wife, a confrontation that would end in tragedy. Bo Rothwell testified that he bludgeoned his wife to death during a heated argument over his affair with another woman. The affair that he had seemingly ended had resumed, and Jennifer had discovered the truth about her husband's double life. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Bo reached for a mallet, a tool that had likely been used for innocent home improvement projects, and struck his pregnant wife in the head. He told the jury that he struck his pregnant wife in the head with a mallet and killed her at their St. Louis County home in November 2019. The brutality of the act is difficult to comprehend. This was not a momentary loss of control with hands or fists, but the deliberate use of a weapon against a pregnant woman who had just discovered her husband's betrayal. In that moment, Bo Rothwell made a choice that would destroy multiple lives, his own, Jennifer's, and that of their unborn child. What happened next reveals a chilling capacity for deception. Rather than calling for help, rather than confessing to what he had done, Bo Rothwell began an elaborate performance designed to conceal his crime. Tuesday, November 12, Bo Rothwell reports his wife, Jennifer Rothwell, missing. Her car was found that night abandoned at Olive and Fifi in Creve Coeur. Bo Rothwell reported Jennifer Rothwell missing at 9:44 p.m. Tuesday. He told police he last saw her early Tuesday. Her car was found abandoned near Fifi Road and Olive Boulevard, about 1.5 miles from her home. Think about the psychological state required to kill your pregnant wife and then, hours later, call the police to report her missing. The planning involved in driving her car to an abandoned location, walking back home, and then crafting a story about her disappearance. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by immediate remorse and confession, this was a calculated attempt to escape consequences. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what came next. Bo participated in a search party for Jennifer, although he knew she was dead. "Yes, I searched for her car, put up missing flyers, and posted on social media," Bo Rothwell cries. Imagine the psychological compartmentalization required to participate in searching for someone you have killed. To look Jennifer's family members in the eye while helping to organize search efforts. To post on social media asking for help finding a missing person when you know exactly where she is because you put her there. The search efforts drew volunteers from the community, people who cared about Jennifer and wanted to help bring her home safely. They walked through wooded areas, distributed flyers, and shared posts on social media. All while the person responsible for her disappearance walked among them, playing the role of the concerned husband. While Bo performed his role as the worried husband, investigators were doing what they do best, following the evidence. In missing person cases, the spouse is always examined closely, not out of prejudice, but because statistics show that when someone vanishes, those closest to them are often involved. The abandoned car was processed for evidence. Jennifer's phone records were examined. Her internet search history was reviewed. And slowly, a picture began to emerge that contradicted the story Bo was telling. The discovery of Jennifer's search about what to do if your husband is upset about pregnancy was particularly significant. It suggested marital problems that Bo had not mentioned to police. Combined with other evidence, it painted a picture of a marriage under strain. Investigators also discovered the affair. This created a clear motive, a husband who wanted to be free of his marriage to pursue another relationship, but who now faced the complication of an unexpected pregnancy. In the minds of investigators, the pieces of a tragic puzzle were falling into place. But they still needed to find Jennifer. The pressure of maintaining his deception while participating in the search for his wife eventually became too much for Bo Rothwell to bear. On November 15, 2019, just 3 days after reporting Jennifer missing, he made a decision that would end the uncertainty but confirm everyone's worst fears. "The body will be on the side of the road," these were the words Bo Rothwell used when he finally told police where they could find Jennifer. Not "my wife" or "Jennifer," but "the body." The clinical detachment in his language was as chilling as his actions. He led authorities to a wooded area in Lincoln County, about an hour's drive from their home in Creve Coeur. This wasn't a location chosen at random. Bo had driven there in the dark hours after killing Jennifer, carrying her body to this remote spot where he hoped she would never be found. The discovery of Jennifer's remains brought an end to the search efforts but marked the beginning of a different kind of investigation. Now the focus shifted from finding a missing person to building a murder case. The prosecution wrapped its case today with testimony from a DNA forensic expert with the St. Louis County Crime Lab. That expert confirmed bloodstains had been found in the Rothwell home. Despite Bo's attempts to clean the scene, forensic evidence told the story of what had happened that night. Blood evidence is particularly difficult to eliminate completely. Even when someone believes they have thoroughly cleaned a crime scene, forensic techniques can often detect traces that are invisible to the naked eye. The bloodstains in the Rothwell home were consistent with a violent attack, supporting the prosecution's theory of what had occurred. The physical evidence was damning, but it was Bo's own words and actions that ultimately sealed his fate. His participation in the search while knowing Jennifer was dead, his initial lies to police, and eventually his confession to the killing created a compelling case for prosecutors. The affair provided motive. The pregnancy provided a timeline that explained why the murder occurred when it did. And the attempts to conceal the crime showed consciousness of guilt. When Bo Rothwell's case went to trial in April 2022, more than 2 years after Jennifer's death, the central question wasn't whether he had killed his wife, he had already confessed to that. The question was whether the killing was premeditated murder or a spontaneous act of violence during an argument. The crux of this case rested on the question, was this murder premeditated or not? This distinction would determine whether Bo faced a charge of first-degree murder, which requires premeditation, or second-degree murder, which covers intentional killings that weren't planned in advance. Prosecutors argued that the Facebook messages between Bo and his mistress showed his desire to be free of his marriage. They suggested that when faced with the complication of Jennifer's pregnancy, he saw murder as his solution. The affair, they argued, provided both motive and evidence of premeditation. St. Louis County prosecutors shared a Facebook conversation from October 30, 2019, between Bo Rothwell and the woman he was having an affair with. These messages, sent just days before the murder, would become crucial evidence in establishing his state of mind. The defense, however, argued that this was a crime of passion. They portrayed Bo as a man who snapped during a heated argument about his infidelity, not someone who planned to kill his wife. Rothwell said he didn't plan on killing Jennifer and feels guilty about the affair. When Bo took the stand in his own defense, he painted a picture of a marriage in crisis and a moment of uncontrolled violence. He recounted his courtship with Jennifer, saying they met at the University of Missouri in spring 2010 in an engineering lab. They moved to the St. Louis area, built a life together, but somehow lost their way. His testimony was emotional. "It haunts me every day," he said, describing the guilt he felt about his actions. But the jury had to weigh his remorse against the evidence of his actions after the killing, the lies, the deception, the participation in the search for someone he knew was dead. The jury deliberated for a few hours before handing down the guilty verdict at around 6:30 p.m. He was also found guilty of tampering with physical evidence and abandonment of a corpse. The deliberation was relatively quick, suggesting that the evidence was compelling and the jury was not torn about their decision. Bo Rothwell was convicted in April of murdering and discarding the body of his pregnant wife, Jennifer Rothwell, in 2019. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Jennifer and her family, but it could never bring her back or restore the life that had been stolen from her. Rothwell, a Creve Coeur man, was convicted earlier this year of killing his pregnant wife, Jennifer, in November 2019 and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During the sentencing hearing, Rothwell apologized to his wife's family during the sentencing hearing and said he thinks about Jennifer Rothwell every single day. But words, however sincere, could not undo the devastation he had caused. Jennifer Rothwell's death sent shockwaves through her community and workplace. "We are deeply saddened about this tragic incident. Jennifer was a skilled engineer who was a trusted friend and colleague. Our DuPont community is grieving and our deepest thoughts and sympathies go out to her family, friends, and colleagues. Her colleagues remembered her as more than just a skilled professional. She was someone they trusted, someone they considered a friend. The loss was felt not just by her family, but by everyone whose life she had touched." Jennifer Rothwell's mother, Robin Von Hausen, said that Jennifer was. The sentence trails off in the court records, but we can imagine the pain of a mother trying to find words to describe a daughter whose life was cut short just as she was about to become a mother herself. The case also highlighted the particular tragedy of domestic violence during pregnancy. Jennifer was not just a murder victim, she was a mother-to-be whose child never had the chance to be born. The pregnancy that should have been a source of joy became, instead, one of the central elements in her murder. As we reach the end of Jennifer Rothwell's story, we're left with questions that have no satisfying answers. How does a marriage that began with young love in a university laboratory end with murder? How does someone who once promised to love and cherish make the decision to kill? Jennifer Rothwell was 28 years old when she died. She had a career she had worked hard to build, a life that was just reaching its full potential. She was 6 weeks pregnant with what would have been her first child. She had plans, dreams, and a future that was stolen from her in a moment of violence. The case serves as a reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. The Rothwells lived in a nice neighborhood, held professional jobs, and seemed to embody success. Yet beneath that surface, secrets and resentments were growing that would ultimately prove deadly. Jennifer's internet search, "What to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant," remains one of the most heartbreaking details of this case. It reveals a young woman who sensed that something was wrong in her marriage, who was trying to navigate what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life with fear and uncertainty. In her final weeks, Jennifer Rothwell was facing the complex emotions that come with an unexpected pregnancy while also discovering her husband's infidelity. She was trying to make sense of her marriage, her future, and her role as a soon-to-be mother. She deserved support, honesty, and love. Instead, she found betrayal and violence. Today, Bo Rothwell sits in a Missouri prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his days contemplating the choices that led to that November night in 2019. He says he thinks about Jennifer Rothwell every single day, living with the knowledge of what he took from the world. But Jennifer Rothwell should be remembered for more than how she died. She should be remembered as a talented engineer who contributed to important work at DuPont. She should be remembered as a daughter, a friend, and a colleague who was valued by those who knew her. She should be remembered as a young woman who was excited about becoming a mother, even if she was worried about her husband's reaction. Her story serves as a reminder of the hidden dynamics that can exist in relationships that appear successful from the outside. It reminds us that domestic violence doesn't discriminate based on education, profession, or social status. And it reminds us that pregnancy, rather than being a time of protection and celebration, can sometimes be a period of increased danger for women in abusive relationships. Most importantly, Jennifer Rothwell's story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life had value, whose death created ripples of grief that extend far beyond the courtroom. She was not just a victim in a criminal case, she was a human being whose life was cut short just as she was preparing to bring new life into the world. In quiet moments, we might imagine what Jennifer's life could have been. The child she would have raised, the career milestones she would have achieved, the joy she would have brought to those who loved her. These possibilities died with her that November night, but her memory lives on in those who knew her and in the justice system that held her killer accountable for his actions. Rest in peace, Jennifer Rothwell. Your story has been told, your life has been remembered, and your death has not been forgotten. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet darkness of December 16, 2000, as most of Tallahassee, Florida slept peacefully, a young father named Jerry Michael Williams, who went by Mike, was already stirring in his home on Centennial Oak Circle. The 31-year-old property appraiser had always been an early riser, especially when duck hunting called his name. On this particular Saturday morning, with the Florida winter air crisp and promising, Mike prepared for what he believed would be another routine hunting expedition to Lake Seminole. Mike was the kind of man who seemed to have life figured out. A Florida State University graduate with a steady career, he lived in a comfortable home with his wife Denise, whom he'd married 6 years earlier. They had an 18-month-old daughter named Ansley, and their life appeared to be the picture of suburban contentment. Mike was known for his gentle nature, his love of the outdoors, and his unwavering loyalty to those he cared about. He was the type of person who would drop everything to help a friend, a quality that would ultimately lead to his undoing. As Mike quietly gathered his hunting gear that morning, careful not to wake his sleeping family, he had no way of knowing that this would be the last time he would see his home, hold his daughter, or kiss his wife goodbye. The events that would unfold over the next few hours had been months in the planning, orchestrated by the two people he trusted most in the world. Lake Seminole, where Mike was headed, was a sprawling body of water that straddled the border between Florida and Georgia. Known for its excellent duck hunting, the lake was also notorious for something else entirely, its large population of alligators. This detail would become crucial to the story that would later be told about Mike's disappearance, a story carefully crafted to explain away what was actually cold-blooded murder. Mike's hunting companion that morning was his best friend, Brian Winchester. The two men had known each other for years, their friendship seemingly solid and built on shared interests. Brian was married to a woman named Kathy, and the two couples often socialized together. From the outside, they appeared to be the perfect picture of suburban friendship, dinner parties, family gatherings, and shared adventures. But beneath this facade of normalcy, a deadly conspiracy was already in motion. What Mike didn't know was that his wife Denise and his best friend Brian had been carrying on a secret affair. The betrayal went deeper than mere adultery. They had made a decision that Mike's life was an obstacle to their happiness, an obstacle that needed to be permanently removed. In the weeks leading up to that December morning, they had carefully planned not just Mike's murder, but an elaborate cover-up that would make his death appear to be a tragic accident. The plan was as cold as it was calculated. Brian would take Mike out to the lake under the pretense of their usual hunting trip. Once they were far from shore, isolated on the vast expanse of water, Brian would kill his best friend. They had chosen the location carefully. Lake Seminole's alligator population would provide the perfect explanation for a missing body. Who would question that a man who fell into alligator-infested waters might never be found? As Mike loaded his gear into Brian's truck that morning, he was completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. He chatted easily with his friend, probably discussing their hunting strategy for the day, the weather conditions, or perhaps his plans for the upcoming holidays. He had no reason to suspect that the man beside him, someone he trusted implicitly, was planning to end his life before the sun reached its peak. The drive to Lake Seminole took them through the quiet back roads of northern Florida. It was still dark when they arrived at the boat launch, the kind of pre-dawn darkness that duck hunters know well. Mike helped Brian load their gear into the boat, probably grateful for such a devoted hunting partner. Brian had always been enthusiastic about their trips, and Mike had no reason to find anything unusual about his friend's behavior that morning. They launched the boat into the dark waters of Lake Seminole just as the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon. Mike settled into his familiar spot, checking his equipment one final time as Brian navigated toward their hunting spot. The lake was calm, the air crisp with winter's touch. It was the kind of morning that Mike lived for, peaceful, promising, full of the simple joy that came from being outdoors with a good friend. But as they moved deeper into the lake, away from any potential witnesses, Brian was steeling himself for what came next. The plan he and Denise had conceived required him to transform from friend to killer in a matter of moments. They had discussed it in detail, how it would happen, what Brian would do afterward, how they would both react when Mike's body was discovered. Every detail had been rehearsed, every reaction planned. The exact moment when Brian Winchester murdered his best friend has never been fully revealed. What is known is that somewhere on that lake, in the early morning hours of December 16, 2000, Mike Williams was killed by the person he trusted most. Perhaps he saw it coming in those final seconds, perhaps the realization of betrayal flickered across his face. Or perhaps it happened so quickly that Mike never knew his friend had become his executioner. After killing Mike, Brian faced the gruesome task of disposing of the body. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a premeditated murder that required careful cleanup. Brian had to make Mike's death look like an accident, which meant staging the scene to support the story they had already planned to tell. Mike's body couldn't simply disappear. There had to be evidence of a hunting accident gone wrong. Brian took Mike's boat and deliberately sank it in a location where it would be found quickly. He scattered some of Mike's gear in the water, his hunting jacket, his waders, creating a trail of evidence that would support the story of a tragic drowning. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Mike had fallen overboard during their hunting trip, the boat had been damaged, and he had drowned in the alligator-infested waters. Brian would claim he had tried to save his friend but couldn't find him in the murky depths. With the scene set, Brian made his way back to shore and began the performance of his life. He contacted authorities to report that his hunting partner had gone missing during what appeared to be a tragic accident. His story was convincing. He and Mike had been hunting when something went wrong. Mike's boat had been found empty and damaged, and despite Brian's desperate search, there was no sign of his friend. The search that followed was extensive and genuine, involving multiple agencies and lasting for weeks. Divers scoured the lake bottom, searchers combed the shoreline, and volunteers joined the effort to find Mike Williams. His hunting jacket and waders were recovered from the lake, supporting Brian's story of an accidental drowning. But Mike's body was nowhere to be found, which authorities attributed to the lake's alligator population. In their minds, the case was tragic but straightforward, a hunting accident where the victim's remains had been consumed by alligators. Meanwhile, Denise Williams played the role of the grieving widow with convincing skill. She appeared distraught at the loss of her husband, grateful for the community's support during such a difficult time. She leaned on Brian Winchester and his wife Kathy, who were, after all, among their closest friends. No one suspected that her grief was an elaborate performance, that she was counting the days until she could collect on Mike's life insurance and begin her new life with Brian. The investigation into Mike's disappearance was thorough but ultimately concluded that he had drowned accidentally. With no body recovered and clear evidence of a boating accident, authorities closed the case. Mike Williams was officially presumed dead, another victim of the dangerous waters of Lake Seminole. The story was sad but believable, and most people accepted it without question. But there was one person who never accepted the official explanation: Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams. A woman of remarkable determination and intuition, Cheryl sensed that something was wrong with the story she was being told. Call it a mother's instinct or simply an unwillingness to let her son's death go unquestioned, but Cheryl refused to believe that Mike had simply fallen out of his boat and drowned. Cheryl's suspicions were fueled by several factors that didn't sit right with her. Mike was an experienced hunter and boater who was extremely careful on the water. The idea that he would somehow fall overboard and disappear seemed unlikely to someone who knew him as well as his mother did. Moreover, Cheryl found Denise's behavior in the aftermath of Mike's disappearance to be strange and inappropriate. While Cheryl was still processing her grief and demanding answers, Denise seemed eager to move on with her life. Within months of Mike's disappearance, Denise had filed paperwork to have her husband declared legally dead. This struck Cheryl as premature and suspicious. Why would a loving wife be so quick to give up hope that her husband might still be alive? The legal declaration of Mike's death in 2001 allowed Denise to collect on his life insurance policies, which totaled nearly $2 million. This substantial sum provided her with financial security and the means to start fresh. But instead of using the money to honor Mike's memory or ensure their daughter's future, Denise seemed to be using it to fund a new lifestyle. Even more troubling to Cheryl was Denise's relationship with Brian Winchester. The two families had been close friends, and it made sense that they would comfort each other in their shared grief. Brian, after all, had lost his best friend, and Denise had lost her husband. But Cheryl began to notice that their relationship seemed to be evolving beyond mere friendship, and far too quickly for her comfort. What Cheryl didn't know was that Brian and Denise's affair had been going on long before Mike's death. Their relationship had been the driving force behind the murder, and now they were free to pursue it openly. However, they had to be careful not to appear too eager or move too quickly, as that might raise suspicions. They maintained separate residences and continued their charade of friendship rather than romance. But their secret relationship became increasingly difficult to hide. Brian's wife Kathy began to suspect that something was going on between her husband and Denise. The signs were subtle at first: late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, a growing distance in their marriage. Kathy tried to dismiss her suspicions, but the evidence of an affair became harder to ignore. By 2005, Brian's marriage to Kathy had deteriorated beyond repair. Unable to continue living a lie, Brian filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was contentious and bitter, with Kathy finally understanding that her husband had been unfaithful. What she didn't yet realize was that the affair had begun long before Mike's death and had been the motivation for murder. With his divorce finalized, Brian was free to pursue his relationship with Denise more openly. In 2005, they married in a ceremony that must have felt like the culmination of their deadly conspiracy. They had gotten away with murder, collected the insurance money, and were now free to live as husband and wife. Their plan had worked perfectly, or so they thought. Cheryl Williams, however, had never stopped asking questions about her son's death. She found the timing of Brian and Denise's marriage to be suspicious, especially given how quickly it followed Brian's divorce. The more she learned about their relationship, the more convinced she became that Mike's death had not been an accident. Cheryl's investigation was methodical and persistent. She spoke to anyone who had known Mike, Brian, and Denise, looking for inconsistencies in their stories or signs that something was amiss. She reviewed police reports, insurance documents, and witness statements, always searching for the detail that would prove her son had been murdered. Years passed, and Cheryl's quest for justice continued. She contacted law enforcement repeatedly, urging them to reopen the investigation into Mike's death. She pointed out the suspicious timing of Denise's remarriage, the quick collection of insurance money, and other details that suggested the case deserved another look. But authorities remained convinced that Mike's death had been accidental, and Cheryl's pleas largely fell on deaf ears. The breakthrough Cheryl had been hoping for came from an unexpected source. In 2012, Brian Winchester was arrested on charges unrelated to Mike's death. He had been accused of kidnapping his ex-wife Denise at gunpoint. The incident had occurred after their marriage had also begun to deteriorate, and Brian had apparently become desperate to prevent Denise from leaving him. During his arrest and subsequent investigation, Brian's behavior and statements raised red flags for investigators. Here was a man with a history of violence who had been present at the scene of Mike Williams' disappearance 12 years earlier. The timing of his marriage to Mike's widow, combined with his recent criminal behavior, suggested that the original investigation into Mike's death might have missed something crucial. The kidnapping case against Brian Winchester opened the door for authorities to take a fresh look at the Mike Williams investigation. This time, they approached the case with a different perspective, viewing Mike's disappearance not as a tragic accident but as a potential homicide. The evidence that had seemed to support the drowning theory was re-examined, and investigators began to see patterns they had missed the first time. One of the most significant developments came when investigators realized that Mike's body had never actually been found. While this had been explained away by the presence of alligators in Lake Seminole, the lack of any physical remains meant that there was no forensic evidence to support the drowning theory. Moreover, a careful examination of the lake and the supposed accident site raised questions about whether the official story was physically possible. As the reinvestigation gained momentum, authorities began to focus on Brian Winchester as a potential suspect. His relationship with Denise, the timing of their marriage, and his recent arrest all pointed to a man who might be capable of murder. The question was whether investigators could find enough evidence to prove that Mike Williams had been killed rather than accidentally drowned. The case took a dramatic turn in 2016 when Brian Winchester agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution in Mike's murder. Faced with serious charges in the kidnapping case and the possibility of spending decades in prison, Brian made the calculated decision to confess to his role in Mike's death. Brian's confession was both shocking and detailed. He admitted that he and Denise had been having an affair long before Mike's death and that they had planned the murder together. He described how he had lured Mike to Lake Seminole under the pretense of hunting, then killed him and disposed of the body. He revealed that Mike's body had not been consumed by alligators as authorities had believed, but had been buried in a location far from the lake. The confession provided investigators with the missing pieces of the puzzle, but it also raised new questions. If Brian was telling the truth about the location of Mike's body, why hadn't it been discovered during the initial investigation? The answer, Brian explained, was that he had never disposed of the body in Lake Seminole at all. Instead, he had buried Mike's remains in a remote location, allowing the alligator theory to serve as a perfect cover story. Acting on Brian's information, authorities searched the area he described and, in October 2017, finally found Mike Williams' remains. The discovery was both a vindication for Cheryl Williams, who had never given up hope of finding her son, and a crucial piece of evidence that proved Mike's death had been murder, not accident. The recovery of Mike's body also provided forensic evidence that supported Brian's confession. The remains showed signs of trauma consistent with homicide, finally putting to rest any lingering doubts about the cause of death. After 17 years, Mike Williams' family finally had proof of what Cheryl had suspected all along, that her son had been murdered. With Brian's confession and the recovery of Mike's body, authorities had enough evidence to charge Denise Williams with murder. In May 2018, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. The woman who had played the grieving widow for nearly 2 decades was finally facing justice for her role in her husband's death. Denise's arrest sent shockwaves through the Tallahassee community, where many people had known the Williams family and had believed the story of Mike's accidental drowning. The revelation that his death had been a carefully planned murder orchestrated by his wife and best friend was almost impossible to comprehend. How could two people who claimed to love Mike have conspired to kill him? The trial of Denise Williams began in December 2018, nearly 18 years after Mike's murder. Prosecutors laid out the case against her, using Brian Winchester's testimony as the cornerstone of their argument. Brian, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, testified about the affair, the planning of the murder, and the subsequent cover-up. According to Brian's testimony, the murder had been motivated by a combination of greed and desire. He and Denise wanted to be together, but they also wanted the financial security that would come from Mike's life insurance policies. Divorce would have meant splitting assets and potentially losing custody of Ansley, but Mike's death would give Denise everything she wanted while making her appear to be a sympathetic victim. The prosecution also presented evidence of Denise's behavior after Mike's death, including her quick move to have him declared legally dead and her collection of the insurance money. They argued that her actions were consistent with someone who knew her husband was dead because she had helped plan his murder, not with someone who was grieving an accidental death. Denise's defense team argued that she was innocent of the murder charges and that Brian Winchester was an unreliable witness who was lying to save himself from prosecution. They pointed out that Brian had immunity from murder charges and therefore had every incentive to blame Denise for a crime he had committed alone. They portrayed Denise as another victim of Brian's violence, manipulated and controlled by a dangerous man. The defense also argued that the affair between Denise and Brian did not prove that she had participated in planning Mike's murder. While they acknowledged that Denise had made poor choices in her personal life, they maintained that being unfaithful did not make her a killer. They suggested that Brian had acted alone, motivated by his obsession with Denise rather than by any conspiracy between them. The trial was closely watched by the media and the community, with many people following every detail of the proceedings. For Cheryl Williams, who attended every day of the trial, it was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of fighting for justice for her son. She had never given up belief that Mike had been murdered, and now she was finally seeing his killers face consequences for their actions. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. In December 2018, Denise Williams was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. The verdict was a victory for prosecutors and for Mike's family, who had waited so long for justice. Denise was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, ensuring that she would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. The sentence was seen as appropriate given the premeditated nature of the murder and the elaborate cover-up that had followed. For nearly 18 years, Denise had lived freely while Mike's family suffered with unanswered questions about his fate. However, the legal saga was not over. In November 2020, a district court of appeals overturned Denise's conviction, ruling that the state had not successfully proven that she had helped Brian Winchester carry out the murder. The appeals court found that while there was evidence of the affair and suspicious behavior after Mike's death, this was not sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Denise had participated in planning or executing the murder. The overturning of the conviction was a devastating blow to Mike's family and to the prosecutors who had worked so hard to bring Denise to justice. It meant that despite Brian's confession and the physical evidence of murder, Denise Williams was once again a free woman. The decision highlighted the challenges of prosecuting a case that relied heavily on the testimony of a co-conspirator who had been granted immunity. The appeals court ruling did not mean that Denise was innocent, only that the evidence presented at trial was not sufficient to support a conviction for murder. The court found that while Denise's behavior after Mike's death was suspicious, it could be explained by factors other than participation in murder. The ruling was a reminder of the high standard of proof required in criminal cases and the difficulty of prosecuting crimes that occurred decades earlier. For Cheryl Williams, the overturning of the conviction was another heartbreak in a case that had already brought her so much pain. She had fought for nearly 20 years to prove that her son had been murdered, and just when justice seemed within reach, it had been taken away again. The legal system that had finally acknowledged Mike's murder had now failed to hold one of his killers accountable. Brian Winchester, meanwhile, remained in prison on the kidnapping charges and other offenses. While he had been granted immunity for Mike's murder, his confession had not saved him from facing consequences for his other crimes. His decision to cooperate with authorities had helped solve Mike's murder but had not restored his own freedom. The case of Mike Williams remains a tragic example of how trust can be betrayed in the most devastating way possible. Mike had no reason to suspect that the two people closest to him, his wife and his best friend, were planning his death. He went to his grave never knowing that his love and loyalty had been repaid with the ultimate betrayal. The murder also highlights the persistent love of a mother who refused to accept the loss of her child. Cheryl Williams' determination to find the truth about Mike's death was instrumental in eventually bringing the case to light. Without her relentless advocacy, Mike's murder might never have been discovered, and his killers might have lived out their lives without facing any consequences for their actions. Today, nearly 25 years after Mike Williams left home for what he thought would be a routine hunting trip, his case serves as a reminder that evil can wear a familiar face. The people we trust most, our spouses, our closest friends, are sometimes the ones most capable of causing us harm. Mike's story is one of betrayal, greed, and the terrible lengths to which some people will go to get what they want. But it is also a story of persistence, love, and the power of never giving up on the truth. Cheryl Williams' fight for her son shows that even when the odds seem impossible and the years stretch on without answers, a mother's love can move mountains and eventually bring justice, even if that justice is incomplete. As we close this story of Mike Williams, we remember not just the tragedy of his death but the fullness of his life. He was a devoted father, a loving son, and a loyal friend. He lived with integrity and kindness, never suspecting that these very qualities would make him vulnerable to those who lacked such principles. His memory lives on not just in the legal proceedings that followed his death, but in the hearts of those who knew him as he truly was, a good man whose life was cut short by evil, but whose story ultimately serves as a testament to the enduring power of truth and love. In the quiet waters of Lake Seminole, where Mike Williams was supposed to have met his end, the dawn still breaks each morning over waters that keep their secrets well. But somewhere in the Florida sunshine, in the laughter of his daughter Ansley as she grew up without him, and in the unwavering love of his mother Cheryl, Mike Williams lives on, a reminder that some bonds are stronger than death, and some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. The case of Mike Williams reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of eventually surfacing. In the darkest betrayals, we find the brightest examples of love and determination. And sometimes, in the pursuit of justice that spans decades, we discover that the most powerful force in any mystery is not the crime itself, but the people who refuse to let it remain unsolved. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The summer of 2017 in Fargo, North Dakota was supposed to be a time of new beginnings for 22-year-old Savannah LaFontaine Graywind. 8 months pregnant and glowing with anticipation, she was just weeks away from welcoming her first child into the world. She and her boyfriend, Ashton Matheny, had been making preparations for their expanding family, even planning to move into a new apartment that very week. But on a seemingly ordinary Saturday afternoon in August, Savannah's life would intersect with a darkness so profound that it would shake not only her family, but an entire community. Savannah was a young woman who carried herself with quiet dignity and purpose. Born in Belcourt, North Dakota, she was a proud member of the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe, later moving to Tokyo before settling in Fargo. She had trained as a certified nursing assistant, choosing a career dedicated to helping others, which spoke to the kind of person she was at her core. Those who knew her described her as gentle, caring, and excited about becoming a mother. Her pregnancy had progressed smoothly, and she was eagerly awaiting the arrival of her daughter, whom she and Ashton had already begun calling their little one. The apartment building where Savannah lived with her family on the 800 block of 9th Street North in Fargo seemed like any other modest residential complex. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other in passing, where the thin walls meant you could hear footsteps above and conversations through the doors. Savannah lived downstairs with her mother, Norberta LaFontaine Greywind, and her younger brother. It was a close-knit family unit, the kind where everyone looked out for one another. Upstairs, in apartment 5, lived a woman named Brooke Lynn Cruz. At 38 years old, Cruz had been living in the building with her boyfriend, William Henry Hone, who was 32. To the casual observer, they might have seemed like ordinary neighbors. Cruz would occasionally interact with the residents downstairs, and on the surface, these interactions appeared neighborly enough. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Brooke Cruz was harboring a secret so dark and desperate that it would ultimately lead to unspeakable tragedy. What the LaFontaine Greywind family didn't know was that Cruz had been telling people she was pregnant. She had been maintaining this elaborate deception for months, going so far as to convince her boyfriend and others in her life that she was expecting a child. The psychology behind such deceptions is complex and deeply troubling. Some experts suggest that women who fake pregnancies may be suffering from pseudocyesis, a condition where a person believes they are pregnant when they are not, or they may be engaged in a more calculated form of manipulation. In Cruz's case, as events would later reveal, this was no delusion born of mental illness, but rather a deliberate and sinister plan. Saturday, August 19, 2017, began like any other weekend day for the LaFontaine Greywind family. The late summer air was warm, and there was a peaceful quality to the afternoon. Savannah, heavy with her pregnancy but still active and engaged with life, was spending time with her family. At 1:24 in the afternoon, she sent a text message to her mother, letting her know that she had ordered pizza for the family's lunch. It was a small, ordinary gesture, the kind of mundane communication that families share countless times without thinking about it. But this text message would later become a crucial piece of evidence in understanding the timeline of what was about to unfold. In that same text message, Savannah mentioned something that seemed perfectly innocent at the time. She told her mother that she was going upstairs to apartment 5 to help their neighbor Brooke with a sewing project. Cruz had approached Savannah with a request that seemed harmless enough on the surface. She wanted Savannah to try on a dress, ostensibly to help with some alterations or perhaps to model how it might look. For a young woman who was naturally helpful and kind, this would have seemed like a simple favor for a neighbor. What Savannah couldn't have known was that this invitation was the culmination of weeks, perhaps months, of careful observation and planning. Cruz had been watching the pregnant young woman who lived below, noting her routines, her pregnancy's progression, and her trusting nature. The request to help with sewing was nothing more than a carefully crafted lure, designed to get Savannah alone and vulnerable. As Savannah made her way up the stairs to apartment 5 that afternoon, she was thinking about the simple task ahead. Perhaps she was looking forward to seeing how the dress would fit over her pregnant belly, or maybe she was just being neighborly, happy to help someone with what seemed like a straightforward request. The stairs she climbed were the same ones she had walked countless times before, but this time, they were leading her into unimaginable danger. When Savannah arrived at Cruz's apartment, what happened next was a horror that defies comprehension. The exact details of the initial attack remain known only to those who were there, but what investigators would later piece together paints a picture of calculated violence and desperation. Cruz had not simply invited Savannah upstairs for sewing. She had lured her there with the intention of taking her unborn child by any means necessary. The attack on Savannah was swift and brutal. Cruz overpowered the pregnant young woman, and in an act of unspeakable barbarity, she cut open Savannah's belly and removed her unborn child while Savannah was still alive. The medical examiner would later confirm what prosecutors suspected: this was not a post-mortem procedure. Savannah was conscious and aware during this horrific ordeal, a detail that adds an almost incomprehensible layer of cruelty to an already heinous crime. The baby, miraculously, survived this traumatic birth. Despite the violence of her entry into the world, the little girl was alive and, remarkably, appeared to be healthy. Cruz had succeeded in the most twisted sense in obtaining what she had been pretending to carry for months. But now she had to deal with the reality of what she had done, and the evidence of her crime lay dying in her apartment. After the attack, Cruz and her boyfriend William Hone worked together to dispose of Savannah's body. They wrapped her in plastic, a cold and methodical action that spoke to the calculated nature of their crime. Savannah, barely clinging to life after the assault, was then transported to the Red River. The exact moment of her death remains uncertain, but what is known is that she was still alive when she was placed in the water, left to drown in the river's current as her life ebbed away. Meanwhile, downstairs, Savannah's family was beginning to worry. When she didn't return from what should have been a simple visit to help with sewing, her mother Norberta began to feel uneasy. By 2:30 in the afternoon, just over an hour after Savannah had sent her text about going upstairs, Norberta sent her 16-year-old son to check on his sister. The teenager knocked on the door of apartment 5 and was told by someone inside that Savannah had already left. But Savannah hadn't returned home, and this was completely out of character for her. She was a responsible young woman, especially careful now that she was so close to her due date. She wouldn't have simply wandered off without letting her family know where she was going or when she would be back. As the afternoon wore on and there was still no sign of Savannah, the knot of worry in Norberta's stomach grew tighter. By 4:30 that afternoon, Norberta made the decision that no mother ever wants to make. She called the Fargo Police Department to report her daughter missing. It had been just over 3 hours since Savannah had sent that text about going upstairs, but for a family that stayed in close contact and looked out for one another, 3 hours of unexplained absence was 3 hours too many. The police response to the missing person report was immediate. Officers arrived at the apartment building to begin their investigation, and what they found was a community already mobilizing to search for one of their own. Friends and family members had begun to gather, organizing search parties and spreading the word about Savannah's disappearance. The Native American community in Fargo, along with Savannah's neighbors and friends, understood the urgency of the situation. A pregnant woman doesn't simply vanish without a trace. As night fell on August 19, search parties combed through the neighborhoods around the apartment building. They called Savannah's name, checked alleys and parking lots, knocked on doors, and asked anyone they encountered if they had seen the pregnant young woman. The search was both methodical and desperate, driven by the hope that Savannah was somewhere nearby, perhaps injured or in need of help, but still alive and still carrying her unborn child. Sunday, August 20th, brought no relief to the LaFontaine Greywind family. If anything, the passage of time only heightened their fears. Family members began making flyers with Savannah's photograph, distributing them throughout Fargo and asking the public for help in finding her. The image on those flyers showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her pregnancy visible and her happiness apparent. It was the face of someone who had everything to live for, someone who was eagerly awaiting the next chapter of her life. The police investigation was intensifying as well. Detectives were interviewing neighbors, reviewing security footage from nearby businesses, and following up on any leads that came in from the public. But in those early days, the trail seemed frustratingly cold. Savannah had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the growing fear that something terrible had happened to her. What the investigators didn't know yet was that the answers to their questions were right above the apartment where Savannah had lived. In apartment 5, Brooke Cruz was caring for a newborn baby that she was claiming as her own. To anyone who asked, this was the child she had been carrying for months, the pregnancy she had been documenting and discussing with friends and family. The timing seemed perfect, the story seemed plausible, and for the moment, Cruz appeared to have gotten away with her horrific crime. But maintaining such a massive deception requires constant vigilance and an ability to think quickly under pressure. As the police investigation continued and questions were asked around the apartment building, Cruz and Hone found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being potential witnesses in a missing person case. They had to walk the fine line between appearing helpful and cooperative while simultaneously hiding the fact that they were responsible for Savannah's disappearance. The days that followed were a blur of activity and anguish for the LaFontaine-Greywind family. Each morning brought the hope that this might be the day Savannah was found, and each evening brought the crushing disappointment that she was still missing. The family held vigils and prayer services, reaching out to their community and to their spiritual traditions for strength and guidance during this impossible time. On Wednesday, August 23, 4 days after Savannah's disappearance, family and friends gathered at Sanford Medical Center in downtown Fargo for a prayer event. They called on the public for help and urged the Fargo police to request assistance from the FBI. The case was receiving media attention now, both locally and nationally, as the story of a missing pregnant woman touched hearts far beyond North Dakota. The involvement of federal authorities marked a turning point in the investigation. The FBI brought additional resources and expertise to the case, including specialized units trained in missing persons investigations and violent crimes. They also brought a fresh perspective to the evidence that had been gathered so far, looking for patterns and connections that local investigators might have missed. As the investigation expanded, detectives began to focus more closely on the apartment building where Savannah had lived. They conducted more thorough interviews with the residents, including Brooke Cruz and William Hone. During these conversations, inconsistencies began to emerge in the stories that the couple was telling. Small details that didn't quite add up, timelines that shifted slightly from one telling to the next, and a nervousness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators learned about the baby that Cruz was claiming to have recently given birth to. The timing was suspicious, coinciding almost exactly with Savannah's disappearance. When pressed for details about the birth, Cruz's story became increasingly convoluted and difficult to verify. She claimed to have given birth at home, without medical assistance, and said that she had not yet taken the baby to see a doctor. For investigators experienced in missing persons cases, red flags were beginning to wave. The coincidence of a neighbor giving birth at the same time that a pregnant woman disappeared from the same building was too significant to ignore. They began to dig deeper into Cruz's pregnancy claims, speaking with people who knew her and trying to verify her story. What they discovered was that while Cruz had indeed been telling people she was pregnant, there was no medical evidence to support this claim. She had not been receiving prenatal care, had no medical records of her pregnancy, and when pressed for details about her condition, her answers were vague and evasive. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, painting a picture that was as horrifying as it was clear. On August 24, 5 days after Savannah's disappearance, police took the extraordinary step of requesting DNA testing for the baby that Cruz claimed was hers. This was a crucial moment in the investigation, as it would either confirm Cruz's story or provide definitive proof that she was lying about the child's parentage. The DNA results would take time to process, but investigators didn't wait to continue building their case. They obtained search warrants for Cruz's apartment and began a thorough forensic examination of the space where they now suspected Savannah had been murdered. What they found confirmed their worst fears and provided the evidence they needed to make arrests. The apartment yielded traces of blood evidence that was consistent with a violent attack. Despite efforts to clean the scene, forensic experts were able to detect signs that a serious assault had taken place there. The pattern of blood evidence suggested that someone had been severely injured in that apartment, and given the circumstances, investigators were confident that the victim had been Savannah LaFontaine-Greywind. On August 25, 6 days after Savannah's disappearance, Brooke Cruz and William Hone were arrested and charged in connection with her murder and the kidnapping of her baby. The arrests brought a sense of relief to Savannah's family and the community that had been searching for her, but they also brought the harsh reality that Savannah was almost certainly dead. The charges against Cruz and Hone included conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and providing false information to police. As details of the case began to emerge through court documents and police statements, the full horror of what had happened to Savannah became apparent. This was not a crime of passion or a random act of violence. but a carefully planned and executed attack motivated by Crew's desperate desire to obtain a baby by any means necessary. The baby, who had miraculously survived the brutal circumstances of her birth, was placed in protective custody while DNA testing confirmed what investigators already suspected. She was indeed Savannah LaFontaine Graywin's daughter, the child that Savannah had been so eagerly awaiting and that had been stolen from her in the most violent way imaginable. Even as the arrests were made and the investigation continued, there was still one crucial question that remained unanswered: where was Savannah's body? Her family needed closure, needed to be able to lay her to rest with dignity and honor. For investigators, finding her remains was also important for building the strongest possible case against her killers. The search for Savannah's body expanded beyond Fargo, with law enforcement agencies from across the region joining the effort. They searched rivers, fields, abandoned buildings, and any other location where a body might have been disposed of. The Red River became a particular focus of the search, as it was a logical place for someone to attempt to dispose of evidence. On August 27, 8 days after Savannah's disappearance, kayakers on the Red River near Harwood made the discovery that everyone had been dreading but expecting. They found Savannah's body, wrapped in plastic and caught on a log in the river. The discovery brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty about her fate, but it also brought the final confirmation of the family's worst fears. The recovery of Savannah's body provided investigators with crucial physical evidence about the crime. The medical examiner's examination revealed the full extent of the violence that had been inflicted upon her, confirming that she had been subjected to what was officially described as homicidal violence. The autopsy also confirmed the horrific detail that investigators had suspected: Savannah had been alive when her child was cut from her womb. This revelation added an almost unimaginable dimension of cruelty to an already heinous crime. It meant that Savannah had experienced not only the physical trauma of the attack but also the psychological horror of knowing what was happening to her and to her unborn child. The level of suffering she endured in her final moments was beyond what most people could comprehend. As the case moved through the court system, more details emerged about the planning and execution of this terrible crime. Prosecutors argued that Cruz had been methodically setting up her fake pregnancy for months, creating a situation where she would need to produce a baby to maintain her deception. When she identified Savannah as a vulnerable target living in the same building, she began to plan the attack that would allow her to steal Savannah's child and claim it as her own. William Hone's role in the crime was also examined closely by investigators and prosecutors. While Cruz was clearly the primary perpetrator of the attack on Savannah, Hone was allegedly instrumental in disposing of her body and maintaining the cover-up that followed the murder. His level of involvement and knowledge of the crime made him a crucial accomplice in one of the most disturbing cases that Fargo had ever seen. The legal proceedings that followed were closely watched by the community and by advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Savannah's case had highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by Native American women, who experience violence at rates far higher than the general population. Her murder became a rallying point for those working to bring attention to this crisis and to demand better protection for Indigenous women and girls. In December of 2017, Brooke Cruz entered a guilty plea to all charges against her, including conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and lying to police. Her decision to plead guilty spared Savannah's family the trauma of a lengthy trial and provided a measure of certainty about the outcome of the case. During the sentencing phase of Cruz's case, prosecutors presented evidence about the planning and brutality of her crime, arguing that she deserved the harshest possible punishment. The court heard victim impact statements from Savannah's family members, who spoke about the devastating loss they had suffered and the ongoing pain of living without her. In February of 2018, Brooke Cruz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that she would never again be free to harm another person, and it provided a measure of justice for Savannah and her family. However, no sentence could truly compensate for the loss of a young woman who had so much life ahead of her and so much love to give to her daughter. William Hone's case proceeded separately, and he ultimately received a sentence of 20 years in prison for his role in the crime. While his punishment was less severe than Cruz, it reflected the court's determination that he too must be held accountable for his participation in this horrific crime. Throughout the legal proceedings, Savannah's family maintained their dignity and strength, even as they grieved the loss of their beloved daughter and sister. They spoke eloquently about the person Savannah had been, about her dreams and aspirations, and about the joy she had felt at the prospect of becoming a mother. They also spoke about their love for Savannah's daughter, who would grow up knowing about her mother's courage and the community that had fought to find justice for her. The baby, who was named Hazley Joe, became a symbol of resilience and hope in the aftermath of tragedy. Despite the violent circumstances of her birth, she was healthy and thriving, a living testament to her mother's strength and love. Ashton Matheny, Savannah's boyfriend and Hazley's father, was awarded custody of his daughter, and she went to live with him as part of a family that would ensure she knew about her mother's legacy. The case of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind had a profound impact beyond the immediate circle of her family and friends. It brought national attention to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, highlighting the need for better resources and protection for this vulnerable population. Savannah's story became part of a larger conversation about violence against women and the particular challenges faced by Native American communities. In the years that followed, memorials and walks were held in Savannah's honor, bringing together people from across the community to remember her life and to advocate for other missing and murdered Indigenous women. These events served both as a way to honor Savannah's memory and as a call to action for continued efforts to address the violence that too many Indigenous women face. The investigation into Savannah's murder also led to changes in how law enforcement agencies approach cases involving missing Indigenous women. There was increased cooperation between tribal and local authorities, improved protocols for investigating such cases, and greater awareness of the cultural and historical factors that can complicate these investigations. For the LaFontaine Greywind family, the pain of losing Savannah was something that would never fully heal. But they found strength in their memories of her, in their love for Hazley Joe, and in their determination to ensure that Savannah's story would not be forgotten. They became advocates themselves, speaking out about the need to protect Indigenous women and to honor the lives of those who had been lost to violence. The apartment building where the crime took place became a somber reminder of the events that had unfolded there. For other residents and for the community as a whole, it served as a stark illustration of how violence can intrude into the most ordinary of places and how the people we think we know can harbor the darkest of secrets. The case also raised important questions about the psychological factors that can lead someone to commit such an unthinkable crime. Experts in criminal psychology studied the case to better understand the mindset of someone who would fake a pregnancy and then murder a pregnant woman to steal her child. While such crimes are extremely rare, they represent a particularly disturbing category of violence that combines deception, desperation, and a complete disregard for human life. In the end, the murder of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind stands as one of the most shocking and heartbreaking crimes in North Dakota's history. It was a crime that robbed a young woman of her future, deprived a child of her mother, and left a family and community devastated by loss. But it was also a crime that brought people together in the search for justice and in the determination to honor Savannah's memory. Today, as Hazley Joe grows up surrounded by love and support, she carries with her the legacy of a mother who was taken too soon but who is remembered for her kindness, her strength, and her excitement about the future they should have shared together. Savannah's story serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life, the importance of community, and the ongoing need to protect the most vulnerable among us. The echoes of that terrible August day in 2017 continue to resonate, not just in Fargo but wherever people work to prevent violence against women and to seek justice for those who have been lost. In their memory, in their advocacy, and in their love for Hazley Joe, Savannah LaFontaine Greywind's family ensures that her story continues to have meaning and that her life, though cut tragically short, continues to make a difference in the world. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. On a warm June evening in 2002, the Smart family home in Salt Lake City's Federal Heights neighborhood settled into the quiet rhythm of another peaceful night. The Victorian-style house, with its white picket fence and manicured lawn, embodied the kind of security that most families take for granted. Inside, Ed and Lois Smart tucked their 6 children into bed, never imagining that within hours, their world would be shattered in the most unthinkable way. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart shared a bedroom with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The girls had spent the evening like any other, perhaps finishing homework, chatting about school, or planning for Elizabeth's upcoming graduation from middle school. The house grew quiet as midnight approached, the only sounds being the gentle hum of air conditioning and the distant murmur of late-night traffic. But someone else was listening to those sounds. Someone who had been watching the Smart home, learning its rhythms, studying its vulnerabilities. Brian David Mitchell, a man whose descent into religious delusion and criminal obsession had been building for years, crept through the shadows toward the house that night, carrying with him a knife and intentions that would terrorize a community and captivate a nation. The man approaching the Smart home was no stranger to the family. Mitchell had worked odd jobs around their property, doing handyman work and yard maintenance. He was known to them as Emmanuel, a self-proclaimed prophet who spouted religious rhetoric and claimed to receive divine visions. What the Smart family didn't fully understand was the extent of Mitchell's psychological deterioration and the dangerous fantasies that had been consuming his thoughts. Mitchell wasn't alone in his delusions. His wife, Wanda Barzee, had become equally ensnared in his twisted interpretation of religious doctrine. Together, they had developed a belief system that justified the most heinous acts as divine commandments. Barzee, a woman with her own history of mental illness and substance abuse, had become Mitchell's devoted accomplice in a plan that would soon unfold with terrifying precision. As the clock struck 2 in the morning on June 5, 2002, Mitchell found an unlocked window on the first floor of the Smart home. The kitchen window slid open easily, almost as if fate itself was conspiring in his favor. He moved through the darkened house with practiced stealth, navigating by memory and the faint glow of street lights filtering through windows. The stairs creaked softly under his weight as he made his way to the second floor, where the Smart children slept. He knew exactly where he was going, to the bedroom where Elizabeth and Mary Catherine lay sleeping, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Elizabeth Smart was, by all accounts, an extraordinary young woman. Popular at school, talented in music, and deeply rooted in her Mormon faith, she represented everything wholesome and promising about youth. She played the harp beautifully, maintained excellent grades, and was beloved by teachers and classmates alike. Her future seemed bright and unlimited, stretching ahead with all the promise that a 14-year-old deserves. In the quiet darkness of their shared bedroom, Elizabeth slept peacefully next to her younger sister. The room was typical of teenage girls, decorated with posters, cluttered with books and personal belongings, filled with the innocent dreams of adolescence. It should have been a sanctuary, a place of safety and rest. Instead, it was about to become the site of a crime that would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. Mitchell pushed open the bedroom door and stepped inside. The floorboards beneath his feet seemed to echo in the silence, but neither girl stirred. He approached Elizabeth's bed, his hand gripping the knife that would serve as his instrument of terror. What happened next would be seared into Mary Catherine's memory forever, a moment of pure horror that no 9-year-old should ever witness. "Don't make a sound," Mitchell whispered to Elizabeth, his voice cutting through her sleep like ice. "Get out of bed and come with me, or I will kill you and your family." Elizabeth's eyes snapped open to find a stranger standing over her bed, his face obscured by darkness but his intentions unmistakably menacing. The knife in his hand caught what little light filtered into the room, and she understood immediately that her compliance was the only thing standing between her family and violence. This wasn't a nightmare from which she could wake up, this was terrifyingly, devastatingly real. Mary Catherine lay motionless in her own bed, her young mind processing the impossibility of what she was witnessing. Every instinct told her to scream, to run, to wake their parents, but Mitchell's threat hung in the air like poison. If she moved, if she made a sound, would he hurt Elizabeth? Would he hurt their entire family? The weight of that responsibility was crushing for a child so young. Elizabeth, demonstrating a maturity and courage that would later be recognized as nothing short of heroic, quietly rose from her bed. She understood the gravity of the situation with startling clarity. Her compliance might save her family's lives, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. Without a word, she followed Mitchell out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and into a nightmare that would last 9 long months. Mitchell led Elizabeth through the kitchen, past the window he had used to enter, and out the back door into the cool June night. Waiting in the darkness was Wanda Barzee, Mitchell's wife and willing accomplice. Together, they had planned this abduction with meticulous care, choosing their victim, studying the house, and preparing a remote campsite where they could hold Elizabeth without detection. The campsite was located just a few miles from the Smart home, hidden in the foothills east of Salt Lake City. It was primitive and isolated, surrounded by dense vegetation that provided natural camouflage. Mitchell and Barzee had been living there on and off for weeks, preparing for the night when they would finally execute their plan. They had supplies, makeshift shelters, and most importantly, they had chains. Within hours of her abduction, Elizabeth found herself chained to a tree in the remote campsite, her ankle secured with a metal cable that allowed her only a few feet of movement. The psychological impact of this restraint was immediate and profound. She was no longer a free person, but a captive, utterly dependent on her captors for everything from food to basic human dignity. Barzee forced Elizabeth to change into a robe-like garment and performed what she called a wedding ceremony, a grotesque ritual that was meant to sanctify the abuse that would follow. In Mitchell's twisted theology, Elizabeth was now his wife, chosen by God to bear his children and serve his divine mission. The ceremony was a mockery of everything sacred, a perversion of religious ritual used to justify the most heinous crimes. Meanwhile, back at the Smart home, Mary Catherine struggled with the terrible knowledge of what she had witnessed. Should she wake her parents immediately? What if Mitchell was still in the house? What if her movement triggered the violence he had threatened? These impossible questions tormented the 9-year-old as precious minutes ticked by, minutes that might have made the difference between rescue and prolonged captivity. Eventually, Mary Catherine's courage overcame her fear, and she crept to her parents' bedroom to wake them with the devastating news. Elizabeth was gone, taken by a man with a knife who had threatened to kill the entire family. The Smarts' worst nightmare had become reality. Their daughter had been abducted from her own bed, snatched away by a stranger in the night. Ed and Lois Smart's initial response was one of disbelief followed by frantic action. They searched the house from top to bottom, hoping against hope that Mary Catherine had experienced a nightmare or that Elizabeth was hiding somewhere safe. But the evidence was undeniable: the unlocked window, the empty bed, the absence of their eldest daughter. They called 911, and within minutes, their quiet neighborhood was flooded with police cars, their flashing lights painting the darkness in shades of red and blue. The investigation that followed was massive and immediate. The Salt Lake City Police Department, the FBI, and countless volunteers mobilized to search for Elizabeth Smart. Her photograph appeared on television screens across the nation, her story became front-page news, and her name became synonymous with every parent's worst fear. The search effort was unprecedented in its scope and intensity, driven by the hope that somewhere out there, Elizabeth was still alive and waiting to be rescued. But Elizabeth was closer than anyone imagined. Just miles from the massive search operation, she remained chained in Mitchell's primitive campsite, enduring abuse that would have broken most adults, let alone a 14-year-old girl. Mitchell's control over her was total and terrifying. He had convinced her that any attempt to escape would result in the death of her family, that his reach extended far beyond the campsite, and that her only chance of survival lay in complete submission. The psychological warfare Mitchell employed was as devastating as the physical abuse. He claimed to be a prophet of God, chosen to receive divine revelations about Elizabeth's purpose in his mission. He told her that her family had stopped looking for her, that they had given up hope and moved on with their lives. He convinced her that even if she escaped, no one would believe her story, that she had been irreparably damaged and would never be welcomed back into polite society. These lies were carefully constructed to destroy Elizabeth's sense of self-worth and hope. Mitchell understood that physical chains alone wouldn't be enough to keep a determined teenager from attempting escape. He needed to chain her mind as well, to convince her that escape was not only impossible but pointless. His psychological manipulation was perhaps even more cruel than the physical abuse, because it attacked the very core of Elizabeth's identity and faith. Barzee played a crucial role in this psychological torture. As a woman, she was able to approach Elizabeth in ways that Mitchell couldn't, offering false comfort while simultaneously reinforcing his control. She would tell Elizabeth that she understood her suffering, that she too had once been in Elizabeth's position, but that acceptance and submission were the only paths to peace. Barzee's participation made the abuse even more confusing and traumatic for Elizabeth, who struggled to understand how one woman could so completely betray another. As days turned into weeks, the national search for Elizabeth Smart continued with undiminished intensity. Her parents appeared on every major television show, pleading for information and refusing to give up hope. They established the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, organized massive volunteer search efforts, and worked tirelessly with law enforcement to pursue every possible lead. Their faith in their daughter's survival never wavered, even as investigators privately began to fear the worst. The case captured the nation's attention in ways that few missing person cases ever do. Perhaps it was Elizabeth's youth and innocence, perhaps it was the randomness of the crime, or perhaps it was the determination of her family that resonated with people across America. Whatever the reason, millions of people followed the story, hoping and praying for Elizabeth's safe return. During this time, Elizabeth was learning to survive in conditions that would have challenged experienced outdoorsmen. The campsite offered no protection from the elements, no privacy, no comfort. She slept on the ground, ate whatever scraps Mitchell and Barzee provided, and endured temperature extremes that ranged from stifling heat to bone-chilling cold. Her body began to show the effects of malnutrition and exposure, but her spirit, remarkably, remained unbroken. Mitchell's religious delusions continued to evolve during Elizabeth's captivity. He claimed to receive new revelations about their mission, about the role Elizabeth was meant to play in his divine plan, about the end times that were supposedly approaching. These revelations often served as justification for increased abuse or for changes in their routine that kept law enforcement guessing about their whereabouts. One of the most disturbing aspects of Mitchell's behavior was his ability to present himself as a harmless eccentric when circumstances required it. When they occasionally ventured into populated areas for supplies, he could transform from a terrifying captor into a seemingly benign religious fanatic, the kind of street preacher that most people would ignore or dismiss as harmless. This ability to mask his true nature made him particularly dangerous and difficult to identify. As summer turned to fall, Mitchell made a decision that would prove crucial to Elizabeth's eventual rescue. He decided to relocate their camp to California. His paranoia about the ongoing search had intensified, and he believed that a change of location would throw investigators off their trail. This decision would ultimately work against him, but at the time, it seemed like a clever tactical move. The journey to California was harrowing for Elizabeth. Traveling while chained and disguised, unable to call for help or alert anyone to her situation, she watched the familiar landscape of Utah disappear behind them. Each mile took her further from her family, from her home, from any possibility of being recognized by someone who might rescue her. The psychological impact of this distance was enormous. Even if she somehow managed to escape, how would she ever find her way home? In California, Mitchell established a new campsite in the hills outside San Diego. The location was even more remote than their Utah hideout, surrounded by dense chaparral that provided excellent concealment. Here, Elizabeth's abuse continued and intensified, as Mitchell became increasingly paranoid and violent. The isolation of their new location meant that even if Elizabeth managed to scream for help, no one would hear her. The change of location also meant a change in the investigation's focus. While law enforcement continued to search in Utah, Elizabeth was now hundreds of miles away, beyond the reach of local search efforts. The case began to grow cold, and investigators started to consider the possibility that Elizabeth might have been taken out of state or even killed by her abductors. But Mary Catherine Smart never forgot the face of the man who had taken her sister. Throughout the months of Elizabeth's captivity, she worked with police artists and investigators, trying to help them create an accurate composite sketch of the kidnapper. Initially, her young age and the trauma of the event made it difficult for her to provide detailed information, but as time passed and her memory solidified, she began to remember more crucial details. It was Mary Catherine who eventually provided the breakthrough that investigators needed. Months after the abduction, she suddenly remembered where she had seen the kidnapper before. He was the man who had done odd jobs around their house, the self-proclaimed prophet who called himself Emmanuel. This identification was the key that would eventually unlock the entire case. Once investigators knew they were looking for Brian David Mitchell, the search took on new focus and urgency. They learned about his history of mental illness, his religious delusions, his marriage to Wanda Barzee, and his previous encounters with law enforcement. They studied his patterns of behavior, his likely hiding places, and his connections to various communities throughout the region. Winter in the California hills was brutal for Elizabeth. The makeshift shelters that Mitchell and Barzee had constructed provided little protection from the cold and rain. Elizabeth's health began to deteriorate more rapidly, and she developed respiratory problems that worried even her captors. The combination of malnutrition, exposure, and ongoing trauma was taking a severe toll on her young body. Despite her physical suffering, Elizabeth's mental resilience remained remarkable. She held on to memories of her family, her faith, and her life before the abduction. She found ways to mentally escape the horror of her situation, drawing on inner strength that would amaze psychologists and counselors who would later work with her. Her ability to maintain hope in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances was nothing short of extraordinary. As winter gave way to spring, Mitchell made another fateful decision. He decided to return to Utah. His reasons were unclear, perhaps driven by homesickness, perhaps by some new religious revelation, or perhaps simply by the practical need to return to familiar territory. Whatever his motivation, this decision would lead directly to Elizabeth's rescue. The return journey to Utah was arduous and dangerous. Mitchell and Barzee, now accompanied by Elizabeth who had been with them for nearly 9 months, had to travel carefully to avoid detection. They used back roads, avoided populated areas during daylight hours, and relied on Mitchell's knowledge of remote camping areas to stay hidden. Back in Utah, the investigation had continued despite the lack of new leads. Elizabeth's family had never given up hope, continuing their public appeals and working with various law enforcement agencies to keep the case active. The community support for the Smart family remained strong, with volunteers still organizing search efforts and businesses still displaying Elizabeth's photograph. When Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth arrived back in Utah in early March 2003, they established a new campsite in the foothills near Salt Lake City. Once again, Elizabeth found herself just miles from her family home, so close to safety yet still completely trapped by Mitchell's control and manipulation. The cruel irony of this proximity was not lost on her. She could probably see the lights of Salt Lake City from their campsite, but she might as well have been on another planet. The break in the case came on March 12, 2003, when alert citizens spotted the trio walking along a street in Sandy, Utah. Something about the group struck witnesses as odd: the way the younger person was dressed, the way she kept her head down, the general demeanor of the 3 individuals. Several people called police to report the suspicious group. When officers arrived to investigate, they found Mitchell, Barzee, and a young person whose identity was initially unclear. The individual was wearing a gray wig and sunglasses, disguised in a way that made identification difficult. But when officers began asking questions, the truth began to emerge in the most dramatic way possible. "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" one of the officers asked. The question hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. 9 months of captivity, abuse, and psychological manipulation had passed since Elizabeth had heard her real name spoken by someone who might actually help her. The moment represented not just the end of her physical captivity, but the beginning of her return to the world of the living. Yes, she answered, and with that single word, one of the most intensive missing person searches in American history came to an end. The arrest of Mitchell and Barzy was swift and decisive. Within moments, they went from being Elizabeth's all-powerful captors to being defendants in handcuffs, facing charges that would likely put them in prison for the rest of their lives. The transformation was stunning in its speed and completeness. The people who had controlled every aspect of Elizabeth's existence for 9 months were suddenly powerless and defeated. Elizabeth's rescue made headlines around the world. The image of her walking free, no longer chained or disguised, became a symbol of hope for families of missing children everywhere. Her survival against such overwhelming odds was seen as nothing short of miraculous, a testament to the power of human resilience and the importance of never giving up hope. The reunion with her family was emotional beyond description. Ed and Lois Smart had maintained their faith in their daughter's survival for 274 days, never wavering in their belief that she would come home. When she finally did, the joy was tempered by the knowledge of what she had endured, but it was joy nonetheless, pure, overwhelming, and absolutely justified. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Mitchell's mental state became a central issue in his case, with defense attorneys arguing that his religious delusions made him incompetent to stand trial. The process of determining his competency took years, during which Elizabeth and her family had to live with the knowledge that her captors had not yet been held fully accountable for their crimes. Barzy ultimately pled guilty to federal charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, though she was released earlier than expected due to time served and good behavior credits. Her release was controversial and caused additional trauma for the Smart family, who felt that justice had not been fully served. Mitchell's case took much longer to resolve. After years of competency hearings and legal maneuvering, he was finally brought to trial in 2010. The trial was emotionally difficult for Elizabeth, who had to testify about her ordeal in graphic detail. Her testimony was powerful and compelling, demonstrating not only what she had suffered but also the remarkable strength she had developed in the years since her rescue. Mitchell was ultimately convicted on federal charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. The sentence brought a measure of closure to the case, though the trauma of Elizabeth's experience would continue to influence her life in countless ways. In the years following her rescue, Elizabeth Smart has become an advocate for missing children and survivors of sexual abuse. She has written books about her experience, spoken at conferences and universities, and worked to improve laws protecting children from predators. Her transformation from victim to advocate has been inspiring to watch, demonstrating that even the most traumatic experiences can be channeled into positive action. The Elizabeth Smart case changed the way law enforcement approaches missing child cases. It highlighted the importance of family input, the value of media attention in generating leads, and the need for sustained search efforts even when cases appear hopeless. Many of the techniques and protocols developed during the search for Elizabeth have since been applied to other missing person cases. The case also brought attention to the problem of child abduction by strangers, a relatively rare but terrifying crime that captures public attention like few others. While stranger abduction represents a small percentage of missing child cases, the Smart case showed that these crimes do occur and that aggressive, immediate response is crucial to a successful resolution. Elizabeth's survival was due to a combination of factors: her own inner strength, her family's refusal to give up hope, the dedication of law enforcement officers, the support of the community, and ultimately, the alertness of ordinary citizens who recognized something suspicious and took action. Each of these elements was crucial to the successful outcome of the case. Today, Elizabeth Smart is a wife and mother, living a life that might have seemed impossible during those dark months of captivity. She has found ways to heal from her trauma while using her experience to help others. Her story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, hope can survive, and that the human spirit has an almost unlimited capacity for resilience and recovery. The campsite where Elizabeth was held captive has long since been reclaimed by nature, leaving no trace of the horrors that occurred there. But the lessons of her case remain relevant: the importance of community vigilance, the power of never giving up hope, and the remarkable strength that can emerge from even the most devastating circumstances. As we reflect on Elizabeth Smart's story, we're reminded that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives have been forever changed by violence and trauma. Elizabeth's journey from victim to survivor to advocate shows us that while we cannot always prevent terrible things from happening, we can choose how we respond to them, and we can use our experiences, even the most painful ones, to make the world a better place for others. Her story continues to unfold, but the chapter that began on that terrible night in June 2002 has been closed. Elizabeth Smart is no longer a victim or even just a survivor. She is a testament to the power of human resilience, a voice for those who cannot speak, and proof that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. The case reminds us to cherish the safety of our homes, the love of our families, and the ordinary moments that make up our daily lives. It shows us that heroism can be found in the most unlikely places: in a 9-year-old girl who found the courage to wake her parents, in family members who refused to give up hope, in law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to solve the case, and most of all, in a 14-year-old girl who endured the unthinkable and emerged with her spirit intact. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we settle safely into our beds, Elizabeth Smart's story serves as both a sobering reminder of the dangers that exist in the world and an inspiring testament to the power of hope, love, and human resilience to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet town of Boulder, Colorado, nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, Christmas morning 1996 should have been filled with the sounds of wrapping paper rustling and children's laughter echoing through suburban homes. Instead, it would become the beginning of one of America's most haunting and enduring mysteries. The Ramsey family lived at 755 15th Street, in an imposing Tudor-style home that spoke of success and comfort. John Ramsey, a successful businessman and president of Access Graphics, had built a life of prosperity with his wife Patsy, a former beauty queen from West Virginia who had once held the title of Miss West Virginia. Together, they were raising JonBenet Patricia Ramsey, their 6-year-old daughter whose blonde curls and bright smile had already begun to capture attention in the world of child beauty pageants. JonBenet was not just any ordinary 6-year-old. Little Miss Charlevoix, Colorado State All-Star Kids cover girl, America's Royale Mississippi National Tiny Miss Beauty. These were just some of the titles this young girl had collected in her brief life. With her mother's guidance, she had entered the competitive world of child beauty pageants, where she would pose in elaborate costumes, her face painted with makeup that seemed almost surreal on such a young child. The pageant world was Patsy's domain, a place where she could relive her own glory days while nurturing what she saw as her daughter's natural talent and beauty. JonBenet seemed to enjoy the attention, the costumes, and the performances, though those who knew her well would later describe a child who was equally happy playing with friends, riding her bike, or simply being a typical kindergartner. On Christmas Day 1996, the Ramsey family had celebrated quietly at home before visiting friends, the Whites, for a Christmas dinner party. It was a pleasant evening, filled with good food and conversation among Boulder's social elite. JonBenet played with the other children, ate dinner, and appeared to be her usual energetic self. The family returned home around 10 p.m., and by all accounts, it seemed like the end of a perfect Christmas day. When Patsy gets up to make coffee around 5:30 a.m., she discovers a 2.5-page handwritten ransom note on the back stairs leading to the kitchen that says her daughter has been kidnapped. The paper felt familiar in her hands. It would later be determined that the note had been written on paper from her own notepad, using a pen from their home. The ransom note was unlike anything investigators had ever encountered. It was unusually long, spanning 2.5 pages, and written in what appeared to be someone attempting to disguise their handwriting. The language was strange, almost theatrical, referencing movies and using phrases that seemed borrowed from popular culture. The note began ominously, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We have your daughter. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her back, see instruction below." But it was the ransom demand that would prove to be one of the most peculiar aspects of the case. It demanded a peculiar amount of money, $118,000, the same amount John Ramsey received for his Christmas bonus as president of Access Graphics. This was not a round number that kidnappers might typically demand, but rather a very specific amount that suggested intimate knowledge of the family's finances. The note went on to claim it was from a foreign faction, and included warnings about contacting the police, threatening that JonBenet would be killed if the family didn't follow instructions precisely. It ended with the chilling words, "You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded." Despite these explicit warnings, John and Patsy Ramsey, her parents, had called police at 5:52 that following morning to report their daughter missing. In their panic and desperation, they also called several friends, including Fleet and Priscilla White, who rushed over to provide support. When Boulder police officers arrived at the Ramsey home, they treated the scene as a kidnapping case. The house was not immediately secured as a crime scene, a decision that would later be heavily criticized. Friends and family members were allowed to move freely through the home, potentially contaminating evidence that might have been crucial to solving the case. Detective Linda Arndt was among the responding officers, and she would later describe feeling overwhelmed by the number of people in the house and the chaotic atmosphere. The Ramseys appeared genuinely distraught, though their behavior would later be scrutinized and interpreted in various ways by different investigators and observers. As the morning wore on, John Ramsey grew increasingly agitated. The kidnappers had not called, despite the ransom note indicating they would contact the family between 8 and 10 a.m. The hours stretched on with no word from the supposed abductors, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension and dread. It was Detective Arndt who suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White search the house more thoroughly, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. This decision would prove to be fateful, as it led to the discovery that would transform the case from a kidnapping into a murder investigation. Around 1 p.m., approximately 7 hours after the initial 911 call, John Ramsey and Fleet White made their way to the basement of the house. The basement was a finished space that the family used for storage and included several rooms, including what was known as the wine cellar, a small, windowless room that had been used for storage. John Ramsey opened the door to the wine cellar, and in the dim light, he saw what no parent should ever have to see. There, on the floor, was the body of his 6-year-old daughter. JonBenet was lying on her back, covered with a white blanket. Her hands were tied above her head with white cord, and around her neck was a makeshift garrote, a horrific device constructed from a length of cord and a broken paintbrush handle that had been taken from Patsy's art supplies in the basement. John Ramsey's scream echoed through the house as he scooped up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, a natural parental instinct that unfortunately further compromised the crime scene. The transformation from missing child case to homicide investigation happened in an instant, and everyone present would later describe the moment as one of absolute horror and disbelief. The autopsy would later reveal the full extent of the tragedy that had befallen JonBenet. She was later found dead in that house, and an autopsy revealed the cause of her death as strangulation. However, the medical examination revealed that the strangulation was not the only injury she had sustained. Reports reveal that JonBenet's skull had been fractured, indicating that she had suffered a severe blow to the head. The medical examiner determined that this head injury was so severe it would have been fatal on its own, even without the strangulation that came later. This discovery raised disturbing questions about the sequence of events and the killer's intentions. The makeshift garrote was made using a length of cord and part of a paintbrush from the basement, indicating that the killer had used materials found within the Ramsey home to create this horrific device. The sophistication of the garrote suggested someone with knowledge of such devices, though experts would later debate whether this indicated military or survival training, or simply someone who had seen such devices in movies or books. Perhaps most puzzling of all, the coroner also found what was believed to be pineapple in JonBenét's stomach. Her parents do not remember giving her any the night before she died, but there was a bowl of pineapple in the kitchen. This seemingly minor detail would become a major point of investigation, as it suggested that JonBenet had eaten something after returning home from the Christmas party, contradicting her parents' recollection that she had gone straight to bed. The Boulder Police Department found themselves facing a case unlike any they had encountered before. Boulder was not a city accustomed to violent crime, particularly not the murder of a child in such circumstances. The department was small, and few of the investigators had extensive experience with homicide cases, let alone one that would soon attract international attention. Detective Steve Thomas was assigned as the lead investigator, and he approached the case with the assumption that someone within the house was responsible for JonBenét's death. This theory was based partly on the lack of clear evidence of an intruder and partly on the unusual nature of the ransom note, which seemed to contain information that only someone familiar with the family would know. However, not all investigators agreed with this approach. Detective Lou Smith, a seasoned investigator brought in to assist with the case, began to develop a different theory. Smith believed that the intruder subdued JonBenet using a stun gun and took her down to the basement. JonBenet was killed and a ransom note was left. Smith's intruder theory was based on several pieces of evidence that he felt had been overlooked or dismissed too quickly. Smith believed the killer entered the basement through this window and used the suitcase to climb back out. He pointed to an open window in the basement, a suitcase positioned beneath it, and what he interpreted as scuff marks that could have been left by an intruder. The investigation was further complicated by the media attention the case received. JonBenét's involvement in beauty pageants, combined with the mysterious circumstances of her death, created a perfect storm of public fascination and media coverage. The case was featured on magazine covers, television shows, and newspaper front pages around the world, putting enormous pressure on investigators to solve the case quickly. The ransom note became one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in criminal history. Handwriting experts were brought in to examine the writing, comparing it to samples from both John and Patsy Ramsey, as well as others who had access to the house. The results were inconclusive, with some experts suggesting similarities to Patsy's handwriting while others dismissed these comparisons as meaningless. The content of the note was equally puzzling. The writer seemed to have an intimate knowledge of John Ramsey's business dealings, referencing his Southern common sense and demonstrating awareness of his exact bonus amount. Yet the note also contained phrases that seemed drawn from movies, including apparent references to films like Dirty Harry and Speed. The length of the note was also unusual. Most ransom notes are brief and to the point, designed to communicate demands quickly without providing unnecessary clues about the writer's identity. This note, however, seemed almost conversational in places, as if the writer had time to compose and revise their thoughts. Some investigators theorized that the note was written after JonBenét's death, as part of an attempt to stage the scene and mislead investigators. Others maintained that it was genuine, indicating that the crime had indeed been committed by kidnappers whose plans had gone tragically wrong. As the investigation continued, attention turned to JonBenét's involvement in the beauty pageant circuit. Video footage emerged of the 6-year-old performing in elaborate costumes, singing and dancing with a sophistication that made many viewers uncomfortable. Critics argued that such pageants sexualized young children and potentially attracted the attention of predators. The pageant community rallied to defend itself, arguing that these competitions were about talent and confidence building rather than anything inappropriate. Patsy Ramsey defended her decision to enter JonBenet in pageants, describing them as fun activities that her daughter enjoyed and excelled at. However, investigators could not ignore the possibility that someone from this world might have become obsessed with JonBenet. The pageants were public events, attended by audiences that included strangers who could have observed the family and learned details about their lifestyle and routines. The investigation expanded to include anyone who might have had contact with JonBenet through the pageant circuit, including photographers, judges, other contestants' families, and audience members. This proved to be a massive undertaking, as JonBenet had participated in numerous events across multiple states. As weeks turned into months without an arrest, public suspicion began to focus on JonBenet's own family. The Boulder Police Department's theory that the crime was committed by someone within the house gained traction in the media, despite the lack of concrete evidence to support this conclusion. John and Patsy Ramsey found themselves under intense scrutiny, with their every action and statement analyzed for signs of guilt or deception. They hired attorneys and public relations specialists, decisions that were criticized by some as indicating consciousness of guilt, though others argued these were reasonable steps for anyone facing such intense public and legal pressure. The couple's behavior on the morning of the discovery was dissected endlessly. Some critics pointed to what they saw as unusual reactions: John's decision to search the house, Patsy's call to friends despite the ransom note's warnings, and their general demeanor throughout the ordeal. Supporters argued that there was no normal way to behave in such circumstances and that grief and shock could manifest in many different ways. Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's 9-year-old brother, also became a subject of speculation, though he was largely shielded from public scrutiny due to his age. Some theorists proposed scenarios in which Burke might have accidentally caused his sister's death, leading to a cover-up by his parents. However, most experts dismissed such theories as highly unlikely given the evidence and the family dynamics. In 1998, Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to examine the evidence in the JonBenet Ramsey case. For over a year, the grand jury heard testimony from witnesses, examined evidence, and deliberated on whether criminal charges should be filed. The grand jury proceedings were conducted in secret, as is standard, but the community waited anxiously for the results. When the grand jury completed its work in October 1999, District Attorney Hunter announced that no charges would be filed, stating that the evidence was insufficient to warrant prosecution. However, it would later be revealed that the grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. Hunter had made the decision not to sign the indictment, effectively blocking the charges from being filed. This decision was controversial and added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. As forensic technology advanced, new possibilities emerged for analyzing evidence from the JonBenet Ramsey case. DNA recovered from JonBenet's body and clothing comes from an unidentified male. This DNA evidence became a crucial element in the case, as it appeared to support the intruder theory that Detective Lou Smith had championed. The DNA profile was entered into the national database, but no matches were found. This meant that whoever had left this genetic material was either not in the system or the DNA was too degraded or contaminated to produce a reliable match. Her father, John Ramsey, believes new technology can and should be used to figure out who it belongs to. He is calling for new testing of the garrote, suitcase, blanket and other items of evidence. The advancement of DNA technology offered hope that evidence previously considered too degraded or contaminated might now yield usable results. In 2008, based partly on the DNA evidence, the Boulder District Attorney's Office officially cleared the Ramsey family of suspicion in JonBenet's death. The letter of exoneration acknowledged that the family had been subjected to unfair suspicion and public criticism while they were grieving the loss of their daughter. Over the years, the high-profile nature of the JonBenet Ramsey case attracted numerous false confessions and misleading tips. John Mark Carr, a 41-year-old school teacher, was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, on August 15, 2006, following a false confession to murdering JonBenet. Carr claimed to have drugged, sexually assaulted, and accidentally killed JonBenet. Carr's confession generated enormous media attention, with many hoping that the case had finally been solved. However, Carr's confession does not line up with the evidence and details of JonBenet's murder. When his DNA was tested, it did not match the unknown male DNA found at the crime scene, and he was eliminated as a suspect. This pattern of false confessions and dead-end leads became a recurring theme in the investigation. The case's notoriety seemed to attract individuals seeking attention or struggling with mental health issues who would confess to crimes they had not committed. Each false lead required resources to investigate and ultimately proved to be a distraction from the real investigation. Despite the passage of nearly 3 decades, the investigation into JonBenet Ramsey's murder continues. In November 2024, the Boulder Police Department said, "The assertion that there is viable evidence and leads we are not pursuing, to include DNA testing, is completely false." The department maintains that they continue to actively investigate the case and pursue new leads as they develop. The case now includes 1,058 pieces of evidence, accumulated over decades of investigation. This massive collection of physical evidence, witness statements, and investigative reports represents one of the most thoroughly documented criminal cases in American history. Modern forensic techniques continue to offer new possibilities for analysis. Advances in DNA testing, digital forensics, and other scientific methods provide hope that evidence previously considered inconclusive might now yield new insights. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has taken over some aspects of the case, bringing fresh eyes and resources to the investigation. Even today, 3 main theories continue to dominate discussions about who killed JonBenet Ramsey. The intruder theory suggests that someone broke into the Ramsey home on Christmas night, either with the intention of kidnapping JonBenet for ransom or with some other motive. Supporters of this theory point to the unidentified male DNA, possible points of entry through basement windows, and the complexity of staging such an elaborate crime scene from within the family. The family involvement theory proposes that someone within the Ramsey household was responsible for JonBenet's death, either accidentally or intentionally, and that the ransom note and crime scene were staged to mislead investigators. Proponents of this theory cite the use of materials from within the house, the intimate knowledge displayed in the ransom note, and what they interpret as suspicious behavior by family members. A third theory suggests that someone known to the family, but not a household member, might have been responsible. This could include someone from the pageant world, a family friend, or an acquaintance who had access to information about the family's routines and finances. The JonBenet Ramsey case transformed the city of Boulder, Colorado, in ways that residents could never have imagined. The quiet, picturesque community known for its outdoor recreation and university atmosphere suddenly found itself at the center of a media circus that would persist for years. The Boulder Police Department faced intense criticism for their handling of the initial crime scene and the subsequent investigation. The case exposed limitations in the department's experience with major crimes and led to significant changes in their procedures and training. The case also divided the community, with some residents supporting the Ramsey family and others convinced of their guilt. This division persisted for years, affecting social relationships and community dynamics in ways that extended far beyond the immediate investigation. The JonBenet Ramsey case became a watershed moment in American criminal justice, highlighting the importance of proper crime scene management, the dangers of media speculation, and the complexity of high-profile investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the case as an example of how not to handle a crime scene. The failure to immediately secure the Ramsey home and limit access to potential evidence became a textbook example of investigative errors that could compromise an entire case. The media coverage of the case also raised questions about responsible journalism and the ethics of speculating about suspects, particularly family members who had not been charged with any crime. The intense focus on JonBenet's participation in beauty pageants sparked broader conversations about the appropriateness of such competitions for young children. For John Ramsey, the loss of his daughter was compounded by decades of public suspicion and media scrutiny. Patsy Ramsey, who died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never lived to see her family officially exonerated. Burke Ramsey grew up under the shadow of his sister's murder, largely avoiding public attention until participating in a television interview in 2016. John Ramsey has continued to advocate for further investigation of his daughter's case, particularly calling for additional DNA testing using modern techniques. He has expressed frustration with what he sees as the slow pace of the investigation and the reluctance of authorities to pursue certain avenues of inquiry. The family has also established foundations and supported causes related to child safety and victims' rights, working to ensure that some positive legacy emerges from their tragic experience. As we reflect on this case nearly 3 decades later, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey remains one of America's most perplexing unsolved crimes. The case has inspired countless books, documentaries, television specials, and online discussions, each offering different theories and interpretations of the evidence. What makes this case so enduringly fascinating is not just the tragic loss of a young life, but the way it exposed the complexities of modern criminal investigation, media coverage, and public perception. The case serves as a reminder that even with extensive resources, advanced forensic techniques, and years of investigation, some mysteries remain stubbornly unsolved. The little girl who once danced and sang on pageant stages, who loved to ride her bike and play with friends, became frozen in time at age 6, her story told and retold but never fully resolved. Her case continues to challenge investigators, inspire amateur sleuths, and serve as a cautionary tale about the fragility of childhood innocence. Perhaps one day, advances in technology or the emergence of new evidence will finally provide the answers that have eluded investigators for so long. Until then, the case of JonBenet Ramsey remains a haunting reminder of a Christmas morning that changed everything, a mystery that continues to echo through the quiet streets of Boulder and beyond. In the end, beyond all the theories, evidence, and speculation, lies the simple, heartbreaking truth: a 6-year-old girl lost her life in circumstances that remain unexplained. Her memory deserves justice, and her case deserves to be solved, not just for her family, but for all those who believe that every child deserves safety, protection, and the chance to grow up in a world where such tragedies are not allowed to remain mysteries forever. The investigation continues, hope persists, and somewhere in the accumulated evidence of nearly 3 decades, the truth still waits to be discovered. Until that day comes, JonBenet Patricia Ramsey remains not just a victim of an unsolved crime, but a symbol of the enduring human desire for justice and the unbreakable bonds between parents and their children. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.